a knight on horseback stood before the Nazi army, full medieval armour, sword drawn, refusing to move. October 1st, 1938. Buchina, Czechoslovakia. The German Wehrmacht rolls toward the border. Tanks, artillery, hundreds of soldiers, and stops. For 7 minutes, Hitler's invasion is halted by one 68-year-old man in armour from the 1400s. The Germans drive around him. He survives. His name was Josef Menčík. He'd ridden 19 miles to block an army, the only Czech who showed up to fight that day, because every Czech soldier had been ordered to stand down, to surrender without resistance, except nobody told the knight. The Rabbit Hole Chronicles? Welcome, tunnellers. I'm Percival Blackwood. That confrontation wasn't an accident. Josef Menčík had been preparing for that moment his entire life. For 34 years, he'd been transforming himself into a medieval knight, not as cosplay, not as a hobby, as an identity. He owned a castle, he wore armour daily, he rejected electricity, cars, every convenience of the modern world. He lived by candlelight in a fortress he'd saved from demolition, teaching children about chivalry and honour, while everyone else rushed toward industrial modernity. And when Hitler's tanks came, he did what knights do. He rode to meet them. What the Germans didn't know, what nobody knew, was that this knight had been preparing for war since he was a teenager. The same fire that would make him block Nazi panzers had already burned down a pub in his youth. The same conviction that would make him face impossible odds alone had driven him to spend 3 decades rebuilding a medieval fortress stone by stone. Josef Menčík's story has everything. Mysterious armour smuggled across borders, a castle restoration that defied reason, an act of defiance that confused the most powerful military in Europe, and a betrayal so complete it stopped his heart. Because the Nazis? They let him live. But his own government destroyed him. Let me show you how a brickworker became the last knight in Europe, and how that knight became the only man who stood up to Hitler when everyone else surrendered. Josef Menčík was born March 14th, 1870, in the village of Dobrž, Bohemia, then part of Austria-Hungary. The family cottage was called U Rytířů, at the Knights, and stood within the ruins of the old castle complex. Almost prophetic. As a boy, Joseph would spend winter nights at the Rakoča family home, listening to old Rakoča tell stories about Dobrž's medieval history, tales of knights and castle glory, of honour and chivalric combat. These weren't just stories to young Joseph, they were blueprints. While other boys dreamed of becoming train conductors or factory workers, Joseph dreamed of becoming something that no longer existed. The fire showed early. As a teenager, Joseph burned down the local pub, just walked in and set it ablaze. The details are murky. Why he did it, what provoked him. But the incident marked him. This wasn't a boy who accepted things as they were. This was someone willing to take dramatic action when pushed. He trained as a goldsmith and woodcarver, travelling across Europe, learning jewellery making and wood carving. He worked in brick factories in northern Germany. He was described as an adventurer, someone who'd seen the world. At 27, he married Katarzyna, called Ema, from Nespis. They had 3 children, František, Marie, and Joseph Jr. Then the war came. World War I, the Great War. The war that shattered empires and killed millions in trenches that turned men into meat. František died on the Western Front. Marie died shortly after the war ended. 2 of his 3 children gone, lost to the modern world's industrial murder machine. Something broke in Josef Menčík after that. Or maybe something crystallised. He'd watched the modern world kill his children. He'd seen what progress and industry and modernity actually produced. Death on an unprecedented scale. So he made a choice. He would reject it. All of it. Everything modern. Everything industrial. Everything that had created the mechanised slaughter that took his children. He would become what the world said was impossible. He would live as a knight. Not pretend. Not play act. Actually live as if the medieval period had never ended. But he needed a castle. In 1911, Dobrusch fortress burned down. The 13th century Gothic stronghold, which had housed the Koch family for centuries before becoming a school, was gutted by fire. The Schwarzenberg family, one of Europe's wealthiest aristocratic dynasties, owned the ruins. They scheduled them for demolition. Why keep a burnt-out medieval ruin? Clear the land. Make room for something useful. Josef Menčík, age 41, working as a brick factory labourer, saw something nobody else did. He scraped together 1,000 crowns, a modest sum reflecting the property's worthless condition as condemned ruins, and purchased the fortress from the Schwarzenbergs. They were probably relieved to be rid of it. Menčík quit his job, moved into the ruins, and began rebuilding. For the next 34 years, from age 41 to 75, Josef Menčík devoted every waking moment to restoring Dobrusch fortress. Not to modern standards, to medieval ones. He worked in conditions sources describe as very poor, living in partially collapsed structures without heat or electricity, using manual labour, traditional techniques, and an obsessive attention to historical detail. His vision was absolute, complete rejection of modernity. No electricity? The fortress would be lit exclusively by candles and torches, hundreds of them, flames dancing on stone walls like they had for centuries. No running water, no plumbing, medieval sanitation, no cars. He travelled everywhere on horseback. Rain, snow, summer heat, didn't matter. Knights rode horses. He filled the interior with his collection. Fossils and quartz crystals, taxidermy specimens, religious paintings, medieval weapons, bones and skulls, coins, artefacts from across Europe. One room held an organ he'd acquired from Raby Castle. Another displayed a wooden crocodile sculpture commemorating the legend that Krzysztof Koch of Dobrusch once brought back a real crocodile from distant travels. The centrepiece, of course, was his armour, full suits from various periods, but his prized possession was a complete medieval French suit he'd smuggled back from France, carrying it with difficulty through Bavaria to avoid authorities. This armour, perfectly preserved, geometrically precise, weighing close to 60 pounds, became his daily wear. And it wasn't just him. His wife Ema didn't merely tolerate this obsession, she embraced it fully. During tours she dressed in period costume, becoming a medieval lady rather than a 20th century housewife. Their children wore period clothing. The entire family participated in Josef's living history project, treating it not as a hobby, but as their actual life. They slept by candlelight. They ate medieval-style meals. They spoke using formal, archaic Czech. They lived as if the calendar read 1450, not 1920. Visitors came constantly. Menčík opened his fortress to everyone, schoolchildren, neighbours, travellers, anyone curious about history. He gave tours with infectious enthusiasm, making medieval life tangible. But this wasn't a museum that closed at 5 p.m. This was his home. He lived this way 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 34 years. By the 1920s, locals called him Fusati Tata, bearded father, or simply the last knight. Every day, Josef Menčík would don his armour, mount his horse, and ride through the countryside in full medieval regalia. The sight became as familiar as the mail carrier, and people loved him. He was courteous to everyone, helped neighbours, served on the municipal council, attending meetings in armour. But his true passion was education. School excursions came constantly. He'd guide children through the fortress in full armour, letting them touch artefacts, try on lighter pieces, hold medieval weapons. Teachers reported he could ignite their passion for history in ways classroom instruction never could. He made Czech medieval history, a history of resistance against foreign powers, feel immediate and relevant. His philosophy, honour, courage, hospitality, generosity. These weren't abstract concepts, they were lived values. He maintained open hospitality to all visitors, poured every crown into fortress restoration, and genuinely believed that one person living by principles could matter. By 1938, Josef Menčík had lived as a medieval knight for 27 years, not as a weekend hobby, as his complete identity, which is exactly what he was about to prove. Adolf Hitler wanted Czechoslovakia's border regions, the Sudetenland. He threatened war. Europe, traumatized by World War I, desperately wanted to avoid another conflict. So on September 30th, 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, and Italy's Benito Mussolini met Hitler in Munich. Notice who wasn't invited? Czechoslovakia. The great powers gave away Czech territory, then informed President Beneš, accept it, or face Germany, Poland and Hungary alone. Worse, the Munich Agreement ceded the areas containing all of Czechoslovakia's border fortifications. Every defensive bunker, every prepared position, handed to Germany. The Czechoslovak army wanted to fight. They'd mobilized. They manned their fortifications. The people supported resistance. They had a real chance. But Beneš, abandoned by his allies, ordered the army to stand down. Withdraw. Let the Germans walk in. Don't fire a shot. Thousands of Czech soldiers, weapons loaded, positions prepared, watched German troops march past unopposed, not because they couldn't fight, because they'd been ordered not to. Except one person didn't get the memo. When Josef Menčík heard German tanks were crossing at Bučina, he made his choice. He was 68 years old. He'd spent 27 years living as a medieval knight. Now the invaders were here, and his entire military was doing nothing. Menčík dressed in his armour, the full suit, 60 pounds of steel plate. He took his halberd and sword, mounted his horse, and rode. 19 miles from Dobruš to Bučina. In full armour, at 68 years old, hours of riding, every step deliberate. He could have turned back. He didn't. Because Josef Menčík remembered the old Czech legend. In the nation's darkest hour, a heroic knight would appear to save the fatherland. Everyone thought it was metaphor. Menčík took it literally. The German column approaching Bučina was substantial. Tanks, artillery, trucks full of infantry. A professional military force executing a planned invasion. They had maps, radio communications, precise orders. Everything the modern Wehrmacht needed. What they didn't have was a protocol for a medieval knight. When they reached the crossing, they found Josef Menčík on his horse, halberd raised, positioned directly in their path. The column stopped. Radio chatter exploded. Officers demanded explanations. Soldiers stared. Some laughed nervously. Others went silent. 7 full minutes. The invasion of Czechoslovakia halted by one old man in armour. Nobody knew what to do. Shoot him? He wasn't technically armed resistance. Drive around him? That felt wrong, cowardly even. Some soldiers tapped their heads. He's insane. But others were quiet, because insane men don't ride 19 miles in full armour with perfect posture. The Germans finally moved forward, slowly. The column split, vehicles passing on either side. Menčík held position until physically forced aside. The entire Wehrmacht column rolled past him. Hundreds of soldiers. They left him standing there, unharmed. Not one soldier fired, not one officer ordered his arrest. They drove away and Josef Menčík rode home. The only Czech who'd shown up to fight that day. What happened next defies belief. For blocking a German invasion, Josef Menčík faced 0 consequences. The Nazis never arrested him, never imprisoned him, never seized his castle, never retaliated. For 6 years of occupation, he continued living at Dobruš Fortress exactly as before, lighting his castle with candles, riding his horse, wearing his armour, teaching Czech children about their history while German troops occupied their country. Why would the Nazis spare him? Because they couldn't process him. Their entire worldview was modern, mechanised, rationalised. A medieval knight living by chivalric code was so far outside their framework they couldn't categorise him as a threat. They looked at him and saw madness, not defiance. He survived the entire occupation unharmed. Then Czechoslovakia was liberated in 1945. The Nazis retreated. Victory. Freedom. And that's when Josef Menčík's real enemy appeared. The communist-influenced Czechoslovak government began nationalising private property immediately after liberation. The Beneš decrees, famous for expelling Sudeten Germans, were also used to seize heavy industry, banks, land, and historic properties. Everything private became state property. Everything individual became collective. In 1945, they came for Dobruš Fortress. Josef Menčík was 75 years old. His health declining, he'd moved from the unheated fortress to live with his son Josef Jr. in Buzičky, a small hamlet near Blatná. But the fortress remained his, legally his. The product of 34 years of labour, of poverty accepted willingly, of every crown he'd earned poured into restoration. The government took it, just signed paperwork and took it. The irony is so sharp it cuts. The Nazis, the genocidal regime that murdered millions, saw Josef Menčík as too eccentric to harm. They let him keep his castle throughout 6 years of brutal occupation. But his own government, the democratic government, he'd served on municipal councils, the Czech nation he'd stood up for at Bučina, the country he'd represented in medieval armour, saw him as a private landowner, a relic of the old order, someone whose property needed to be redistributed for the collective good. The fortress he'd saved from demolition in 1911. The fortress he'd restored stone by stone. The fortress where he'd taught thousands of Czech children about their history and heritage. The fortress that represented everything he'd worked for. Nationalised, seized, gone. November 19th, 1945. Days after the seizure. Josef Menčík died at his son's home. He was 75 years old. Officially, he died of natural causes related to age and declining health. But everyone who knew him understood the truth. The fortress wasn't just a building. It was the physical manifestation of his life's philosophy. It was proof that one person could reject modernity and survive. It was evidence that the past wasn't dead, that chivalric values still mattered, that honour and courage were real things you could live by. When they took the fortress, they didn't just take property. They took his purpose, his identity, his entire reason for existing. The man who'd faced Nazi tanks died when his own people took his castle. The last knight didn't fall in battle. He died of bureaucracy. We need to stop here. Because everything I've told you so far, every detail about Josef Menčík's life, his confrontation with the Germans, his survival through the war, is documented in Czech historical records. Local museums confirm it. Oral histories support it. His existence is verified. But there are things about this story that don't quite add up. Details that suggest the legend might be bigger than the man, and we need to talk about them. Because the truth about Josef Menčík is more complicated than the hero narrative, more troubling, more human. First, the myths. Josef Menčík's story has been embellished significantly. He didn't come from noble lineage. Czech historians have debunked this thoroughly. He came from a farming family, peasant stock. He was a brickworker's son who created his own identity from nothing. The armour origin is disputed. Popular accounts say he smuggled it from France. Some historians suggest he acquired it in Germany. We don't know for certain. He probably didn't own the entire fortress. Historian Ladislav Kolachkovsky argues he only purchased house number 42 within the complex. If true, it changes the nationalisation story, though the emotional impact would have been the same. The confrontation has been exaggerated. He didn't charge the tanks. He sat there. He blocked the road. The 7 minutes might have been 5 or 3. The locals called him eccentric. Fuzati Tata, bearded father, with a gentle, patronising quality. The Germans called him the local idiot. They tapped their heads. Was he crazy? Probably by conventional standards. A man who completely rejects the modern world to live as a medieval knight isn't mentally typical. But when every sane person in Europe was appeasing Hitler, when rational governments were calculating surrender, when educated military leaders followed orders to stand down, the crazy man acted. Today, Dobruš Fortress stands. The Dobruš Restoration Association manages it, opens it to visitors. You can walk the courtyards where Menčík lit torches, touch the walls he restored. Czech culture celebrates him as the Czech Don Quixote. His story appears in books, films, documentaries. Festivals reenact his stand. Children learn about him in schools. But the final twist, the Dobruš Restoration Association website lists significant personalities connected to the fortress: a 20th century priest, a 17th century preacher. Josef Menčík, who saved the fortress from demolition, spent 34 years restoring it, made it internationally famous, is not listed. The fortress he saved doesn't acknowledge him. Too complicated, too eccentric. The legend works globally, but locally, still just a crazy man who swallowed fish whole and wore armour to council meetings. The modern world in 1938 produced the Munich Agreement, produced appeasement, produced World War II. Rational people created Auschwitz. Educated bureaucrats organised genocide. The sane approach: calculate odds, be practical, stand down when ordered. Result? 60 million dead. One brick worker who thought he was a medieval knight rode 19 miles to block an army. Futile, militarily meaningless. 87 years later, we're still talking about him. Name the generals who gave the stand-down order, the politicians who ratified Munich, anyone else from that day. The practical people are forgotten. The old man in armour is immortal. The 20th century killed 100 million people in 2 world wars, created weapons that could end all life. Menčík looked at this and said, no. His values, honour, courage, protection of the weak, those aren't crazy. Those are what the century needed. He didn't prevent the invasion, didn't change the outcome. But for 7 minutes the Wehrmacht had to stop and acknowledge that something existed outside their framework, something they couldn't process or defeat. A man who refused. Josef Menčík died November 19th, 1945, age 75. The fortress stands. Czech children still learn about the last night. One autumn day in 1938, when an entire nation surrendered without firing a shot, one old man in armour rode out. He lost, but he showed up. That's our episode, tunnellers. I'm Percival Blackwood for the Rabbit Hole Chronicles. The modern world tells you to be reasonable. Calculate odds, surrender when practical. Josef Menčík rode out in medieval armour to face Nazi tanks. History called him crazy. We're still telling his story. The Rabbit Hole Chronicles is an independent production. Josef Menčík's story is documented in Czech historical archives and confirmed by historians including Pavel Fenkel of the Prachatíče Museum. Just maybe leave the armour at home.